at the time, comes out and says, I don't think she was doing it on purpose. The coach says that.
Something about the Stephanie White controversy isn't adding up. What started as one brutal foul on Sophie Cunningham has now turned into a much bigger fight over loyalty, leadership, trust, and the future of the Indiana Fever. First, DiJonai Carrington was ejected. Then people questioned Stephanie White's reaction. Fever fans started booing their own coach. Then White fired back. Then White said she didn't see the foul in real time, but there was footage of White on the sideline as the play happened.
The play in the last game, I didn't see the play in real time. I went straight to a press conference. I thought the play got called right. Thankfully, Sophie's okay.
And suddenly the question changed. It wasn't, was the foul flagrant? It became, did Stephanie White's explanation actually match what viewers saw? And just when that controversy couldn't get any bigger, Sophie Cunningham defended her coach. Caitlin Clark defended her coach. And now Patrick Bet-David has entered the conversation.
Play in the last game, I didn't see the play in real time.
That's her in the back.
You sure about that? You sure about that?
I went straight to a press conference.
So you can pause it right there.
And that's her right there.
That's her in the back. And that's the foul.
Here comes kindness.
I stand by them. I will always stand by them.
Amen.
Everybody else can go to hell.
Oh, wait a minute.
Kindness.
Wait a minute.
So you know what? We need kindness.
Great.
So what is actually going on inside the Fever? Because this story has gone from one foul to a coach under fire to a locker room controversy to a much bigger debate about leadership and credibility. And we're going to follow the entire escalation. Let's start with the moment that triggered all of this. Sophie Cunningham takes the court. DiJonai Carrington makes the defensive play. The contact is hard. Cunningham goes down, and the officials make the call. Flagrant 2. Carrington is ejected. At that point, you might think the controversy is over. A hard foul, an official review, an ejection, case closed. But then Stephanie White was asked about it, and that's when the story took its first turn. White didn't immediately describe Carrington as a dirty player. Instead, she talked about Carrington's intensity, her competitiveness, the way she plays defense, and she said she didn't believe the contact was intentional. That reaction immediately raised eyebrows.
Yeah, I mean, look, it was a hard foul. I don't think that DiJonai intentionally came out to get her across the neck like she did, but it did happen, and I thought it was the right call. But, you know, one of the things about Nay is that she's going to play her butt off, man. She's going to compete. Nobody's going to go walking in for a layup. And so I don't oppose the hard foul. But I also don't think that she intentionally went for the neck.
Because the player on the receiving end was Sophie Cunningham, and the person defending the opposing player was Sophie Cunningham's own coach. So fans started asking, why isn't Stephanie White defending Sophie? And then another detail became important. White had previously coached Carrington. Suddenly people weren't just talking about basketball, they were talking about relationships. Was White simply giving a former player the benefit of the doubt, or was she being too sympathetic toward Carrington? That question started spreading, and then it got much worse. The criticism didn't stay online, it reached the arena. Some Fever fans began booing Stephanie White, and that's when this became a completely different story, because now we're no longer talking about Carrington versus Cunningham. We're talking about Fever fans versus Stephanie White. A coach was suddenly being questioned by her own supporters, and the obvious question became, how much longer can this continue before it becomes a genuine leadership crisis? White wasn't going to sit quietly and take it. She responded, and her response was explosive. White made it clear that the criticism had become personal. She said she takes it personally when people question whether she has her players' backs. She emphasized that she stands with her players. She talked about love, grace, humility, kindness, and then she delivered the line that instantly became the headline, "Everybody else can go to hell." That changed the energy, because now White wasn't simply answering questions, she was fighting back, and that created a new controversy. Was Stephanie White standing up for her team, or was she making an already explosive situation even bigger? But then another issue emerged, one that would become the centerpiece of the entire debate. White later explained that she didn't see the play in real time. She said she went straight to the press conference and initially believed the officials had made the correct decision. Then she watched the replay, and after seeing it repeatedly, she acknowledged how serious the foul was. If that had been the end of the story, maybe everyone would have moved on. But then people went back to the footage, and they noticed something. White appears to be watching the play from the sideline. And suddenly, the controversy had a new question. If she didn't see the foul in real time, what exactly was she seeing from the bench? Now critics had a completely different argument. They weren't just questioning her opinion, they were questioning whether her later explanation matched what happened on the sideline. And this is where we need to make one thing clear. The footage can show where White was looking. It cannot tell us exactly what she perceived in that moment. So saying White lied goes beyond what the footage proves. But asking whether her explanation is consistent with the footage, that's a legitimate question, and that question exploded. And just when the story started to calm down, another controversial incident involving Carrington gave the critics something new to talk about. More physical contact, more debate, more replay footage, more people asking, is this just aggressive basketball? Or is there a bigger pattern here? Now White's original comments were being looked at through a completely different lens. Because when something happens once, people can call it an isolated incident. When similar incidents happen again, people start looking for connections. And suddenly White's phrase about Carrington simply playing hard was being debated all over again. And that's when the real controversy emerged. Because ultimately, this isn't only about whether Carrington committed a flagrant foul. It's about what a coach is supposed to do when her player is at the center of a controversial incident. Does she defend the opposing player? Does she defend her own player? Does she stay neutral? There isn't necessarily one perfect answer, but fans clearly wanted one thing. They wanted to know where Stephanie White stood. And some fans believe they didn't get a strong enough answer. That's why the criticism became personal. That's why the boos started. And that's why White eventually had enough. Instead of backing away, White doubled down. She made it clear that she wasn't going to allow outside criticism to define her relationship with her players. She said she leads with love. She leads with grace and humility. And she insisted that the Fever were united. Then again came that unforgettable line, "Everybody else can go to hell." Now the controversy had become bigger than the original foul. It was now about,
I stand by them. I will always stand by them. Everybody else can go to hell.
who controls the narrative? The critics, the fans, the media, or the team itself? And then something happened that complicated the entire story. Sophie Cunningham herself stepped forward, and she didn't accuse her coach of abandoning her. She defended White. Cunningham explained that White hadn't seen the play in the way people were suggesting, and emphasized that she had a good relationship with her coach. Think about what that does to the controversy. For days, people had been arguing, Stephanie White doesn't have Sophie's back, and Sophie Cunningham's response was essentially, that's not how I see it. That doesn't automatically settle the debate, but it does make the story much more complicated, because now the player at the center of the controversy isn't demanding that White be punished. She's defending her. And then another major voice entered. Caitlin Clark also defended Stephanie White. Clark criticized the treatment of her coach and expressed frustration with fans booing White. And suddenly, the balance of the story shifted again. At first, fans were attacking White. Then, White fought back. Then, Sophie Cunningham defended White. Then, Caitlin Clark defended White. Now the story wasn't White has lost the locker room. It was almost the opposite. The players were publicly telling everyone, we're together. And that's when this controversy became much more interesting, because if the players themselves are standing behind White, what exactly are the critics trying to prove? And now this story has escaped the Fever because Patrick Bet-David has entered the conversation, and this is where the controversy gets bigger, because Bet-David isn't simply looking at one foul. The broader question is about leadership, accountability, public perception, and what happens when an organization loses control of its own narrative. And that's the interesting part, because Stephanie White may believe this is simply outside noise. But from the outside, the story looks very different. A coach gave an initial reaction. Critics challenged it. A later explanation raised more questions. Footage was brought back into the conversation. Fans reacted. Players defended their coach. And now outside commentators are examining the entire situation. At this point, the original foul almost feels like the smallest part of the story. And here's where Sophie Cunningham becomes important again, because Cunningham wasn't already a neutral figure when this happened. She had already become controversial because of her outspoken views about women's sports and transgender athletes. That means the foul landed in the middle of an existing cultural debate. So people weren't simply watching a basketball play. They were bringing their existing opinions about race, gender, women's sports, transgender athletes, player treatment, and WNBA culture into the same conversation. That's why the story became so explosive, and that's why one incident could produce so many different arguments. Cunningham's stance on women's sports has made her a polarizing figure, and it raises a bigger question for the WNBA. How should women's professional sports define eligibility? Supporters argue women's leagues exist to preserve competition between female athletes. Critics counter that transgender athletes shouldn't be excluded based solely on gender identity. The league has had to navigate that political debate while trying to keep the focus on basketball. Look at how far this story has traveled. A foul became a coaching controversy, then a fan controversy, then a media controversy, and now a broader debate about the future of women's sports. That's a massive escalation from where this began. Here's the twist. This controversy was supposed to divide the Fever, but instead the players rallied around their coach. Sophie defended White. Caitlin defended White. White says the team is united, and even the fans who booed her didn't stay hostile. She later got a much warmer reception. Maybe the biggest lesson here is that the people inside the locker room don't see the controversy the same way the people outside it do. That's the problem for anyone trying to understand what really happened. The audience, the commentators, and the fans only see the clips, but the players and coaches are the ones who were actually there, with information and relationships the rest of us simply don't have. That's why this controversy isn't finished. The next time Carrington is involved in a controversial play, people will remember this. The next time White defends her, people will remember this. The next time Cunningham speaks about women's sports, people will remember this. And the next time the WNBA addresses transgender eligibility, this entire debate could come roaring back. One foul started it. The explanations escalated it. The footage changed the conversation. The players complicated it. And now outside voices like Patrick Bet-David are making the story even bigger. So the real question isn't, was Stephanie White right or wrong? It's whether the Fever can actually move past this, or whether White has become permanently tied to one of the WNBA's biggest controversies. Because if another spark hits, this whole thing could explode all over again. What do you think? Was Stephanie White unfairly targeted? Did the footage raise legitimate questions? Or are fans and commentators turning one complicated basketball incident into something much bigger than it ever needed to be? Let me know in the comments. And if you don't want to miss the next chapter of this story, make sure you're subscribed.